Welcome to the Believe in USC podcast. It is a joyous podcast if you're a Trojan fan because Trojans are coming off of a 27-20 last second win over LSU in Las Vegas. I'm Cooper Perkins, your host, and thrilled to be joined by Luca Evans of the Southern California News Group. Luca, awesome to talk to you, man. You were down there on the ground. Just take me through Vegas. What was it like? What was the atmosphere? I mean, that has to have been just an electric environment. It certainly came through on television. I was bummed to not be there, but what did you see?
Man, I wrote that it was like an early Mardi Gras a little bit for LSU fans just coming in off the plane from Baton Rouge, and you saw so many fans just wearing golden face paint and purple bling and everything, and there was a little bit of a majority LSU crowd. I would say somewhere 60-40, 70-30, something like that, and so a little bit of a hostile environment in a lot of cases for USC, but the stadium Allegiant was completely packed out. You didn't see a sliver of empty seat in the place. I think it broke the attendance record that was set by the Super Bowl in February, which was absolutely incredible. And it just was this really, you had the smoke from these pregame firework cannons just hanging over the turf for the entire ball game. And it was just this it felt like this just headlining act to a Vegas Labor Day weekend. And couldn't have asked for a better game if you were a fan coming in, regardless if you're a USC or LSU fan. So yeah, just a really awesome and incredible environment.
On one hand, like it was so much fun to see, right? Because it's both a great thing and an exciting thing to see USC as what you just described as a headlining act, kind of. It's a standalone game on a Sunday. It's a game that had been scheduled a couple of years back, and on the other hand, it does kind of bum me out a little bit that game wasn't either at the Coliseum or in Death Valley. That's truly like college football to me, where it's on campus and you know, I don't think we're going to see many of those games anymore, for better or for worse, but we can still enjoy this for what it was. It was just a phenomenal game. It was clearly an electric environment. And I made an appearance on a New Orleans area radio show last week, and it was funny because the host kind of, ribbed me a little bit saying, it was going to be an LSU home game. And like, I kind of thought he was full of it, but it kind of turned out to be pretty true. I
And it
mean,
did a little bit.
especially in that fourth quarter, right, where they're driving into the LSU section and Miller Moss is covering up the ear holes, trying to hear anything at all. But I think that's also a great thing. It's a great experience for them, right? Like it's kind of like a big road test light, like where you still have to get on the plane, do the hotel thing, and then you have a hostile environment, but it's not too hostile, So they'll get their test of that in a couple of weeks when they go to the big house, but not a bad thing, to have a little bit of that. But when
Yep.
we were going into this game, I had a couple conversations with national analysts, Barrett Sallee being one, Rhett Lewis from the Big Ten Network being another. And like the consensus from those guys was like, until USC can tackle, we cannot take them seriously. We just can't. That's the bar. They have to clear that bar, which is on the floor. But until they can tackle, they're not to be taken seriously. And so I went into this game thinking that all I care about the first, three possessions on defense is how's the tackling. Like, can they tackle? Are they gang tackling? How's the open field tackling? And I was absolutely blown away. Yeah, I was completely and totally shocked. I mean, I remember jumping up and like screaming off the couch, like, "Oh my God, we can tackle! Like, we can tackle this year. This is insane." And you look at some of the guys, right? You look at Kamari Ramsey, who really stood out as just being a phenomenal open field tackler. The safeties were great in run support. The linebackers looked much improved. And, I think we're going to talk plenty about this and the holistic improvement of the defense. But, like, what was your reaction? Because for me, it was legitimately shock. We've talked so much all offseason about improvements and changes in philosophy, but, like, that was tangible. And it was very visible immediately that there was an entirely different mentality in those one-on-one situations where it's man versus man.
Yeah, I mean, technique wise, mentality wise, aggressiveness wise, I think the thing that the couple of points with that stuck out to me most kind of immediately or earlier on was, you had that first LSU drive where they're just kind of marching down the field, and Garrett Nussmeier is just kind of, dinking and dunking and slowly just picking apart USC. I think it was like 13 plays, 74 yards or something. And you're like, okay, there's signs of improvement here, but ultimately this defense is kind of, bending to the point of breaking again. And then you see them mount, a legitimate goal line stand on a third down and a fourth down. You see Dan Lynn dial up kind of a little bit. It looked like a safety blitz or a linebacker blitz or something on a fourth down, which is a gutsy call. And force a turnover on downs, and immediately that was something that, that those gutsy, third down stops. LSU was 1 of 4 on third down that entire game. That's something that this program didn't have a lot of last year or the last 2 years, and that's something that stood out as an immediate kind of difference to me. And then you mentioned, Kamari Ramsey and a lot of these transfer guys who've come in and made an immediate impact. And Ramsey I mean, he's just going to be, a stud. Some of the plays that he made in one-on-one situations were just phenomenal. But to me, what stood out was just the sheer improvement from some of the returning guys, which is, really what kind of lets you know the impact that, there's been a lot of talk and kind of hype from players this offseason about how Danton Lynn puts them in positions to just best take advantage of what they're good at. Essentially, at the end of the day, is very player-led scheme on some level. And you look at guys like Eric Gentry, who, he showed plenty of flashes last year, but he's flying around, 7 tackles, something like that. Even like defensive linemen like, Kobe Pepe being put in big run stuffing situations at times, and helping out with that on the defensive line. I just saw a lot of improvement in kind of different players in a lot of these returners. And I think that's how you know that this defense, there were plenty of holes. There were, still plenty of issues, but the change, the overall philosophical change is real. And I think that's something that, Trojan fans have plenty of reason to be optimistic about for the rest of the season.
Yeah, there are two things in this game that really jumped out to me from a personnel standpoint, the defense. And I looked at this game as a really good barometer on what this defense was going to look like based on how they use Eric Gentry, right? Because 2 years ago, when he made that transfer over from ASU, they just threw him out there and said, go be long, get in passing lanes, and just be a problem. We know you're not very big. You're not the best tackler at this phase. And then last year, coming off the injury, it felt like they legitimately did not know how to use him. So they just chose not to play him. And, there was some back and forth about it being rust as opposed to a personnel decision. In that case, I tend to believe the player ahead of the coaches and think that he was healthy and they just didn't know how to use him. So they chose not to. And seeing that they deployed him in a really deliberate way where they put him in positions. I mean, you look, he deflected a pass that would have gone for probably a 25-yard gain to Mason Taylor, just enough to hit him in the hands and drop it, right? But like that's what Eric Gentry brings to this defense, those long arms in passing lanes that just throw things off the slightest bit. And watching them actually know how to use him, or at least have a plan on how to use him, was ultimately very encouraging. The other big takeaway I had from a personnel standpoint was I think Lincoln Riley and Eric Henderson were validated in their decision to not really pursue anyone of substance in the transfer portal on the defensive line. And that sounded like a really aggressive gamble throughout the totality of the offseason. But you talk about guys like Kobe Pepe stepping up. I mean, Gavin Meyer was excellent. Nate Clifton, who was kind of an under the radar guy from Vanderbilt, was fantastic. We hardly heard Bear Alexander's name called. I mean, he did get double teamed. Also, probably didn't play as much as I think we might have expected. We know that Danton Lynn rotates his defensive lineman a lot more than Alex Grinch did. But I'm curious what your opinion is on that personnel choice to stick with what they had in the room. I mean, they made a really conscious choice to say, we're good with what we got. I think we can get something out of them. And they were proven right, at least for a week.
I would I I think you're right. I would be conscious of the fact that well, USC did pursue, a few names on the defensive line in the portal in both the fall and the spring. They ultimately went elsewhere. Now, Lincoln Riley did say USC went after a couple of guys in the spring who they ultimately felt like weren't going to be a culture fit, to what USC is building in the locker room. So, whatever you make of that, it's not like USC was, from the jump saying, hey, we're good with what we have. We're not going to pursue anyone. So at a certain point, they knew all along that was going to be that, Riley said in the offseason that they were going to pursue help at that spot. But at a certain point, it's very fair to say that I think they felt comfortable with enough with what they had in the room. Um, and I think from a run stopping, a run stuffing perspective, this front and the as well the commitment to beefing up in the off season, you saw that make a ton of difference with even just guys on the edge like, Braylon Shelby, um, just the massively kind of different shift from what we saw from him last year. Um, but I think that defensive interior did show a lot against a really strong LSU offensive line. The one area that I do think is necessary for improvement there is continuing to be able to, affect the pocket, when in passing situations. And, Garrett Nussmeier dropped back pretty clean for a majority of the game. He was getting the ball out really quick. But that is an area that, if you're USC, you want to try and, have a little bit more pressure. But I do think for the most part, yeah, like you mentioned, Nate Clifton was really excellent. They trusted Kobe Pepe. They trusted Gavin Meyer, and I do think that front probably proved a little bit more than what people were expecting from them, considering kind of the talent level on paper.
I mean, and you look at the numbers, right? It reinforces that takeaway. They held LSU to 117 yards rushing, 4.5 yards a carry. And if you take out the one, 39-yard John Emery run, that's 3.1 yards a carry, So against a really good offensive line, or at least a very highly touted offensive line. I feel like we've seen this in college football many times where a position group has a couple of big time players. Often it's the offensive line or defensive line where there needs to be a degree of cohesion that goes along with just individual talent, and there's some kind of disconnect. I think ultimately we may look back at this LSU offensive line and think that collectively they were pretty overrated, even though, Campbell and Jones may end up being first round picks when it's all said and done. They just didn't look very uh, communicative and particularly comfortable with one another. I mean, they did a great job in pass protection,
Yeah,
which is significantly easier than run blocking for the most part. I also think that you look at the pass defense and how that, impacts the pass rush. I don't think that Danton Lynn really prioritized pressuring the quarterback in this game. I think that the idea was we're going to run our base defense, we're going to run blitz situationally, and then we're going to dial up something when either it's highly unexpected or when it's a great risk reward opportunity. And I thought that was interesting because, organizations have a tendency to take on the personality of their leadership. And I think that's what we saw with this defense, that it kind of took on Danton Lynn's personality of we're going to do what we're going to do very deliberately. We're going to be fairly conservative between the 20s. But when we have an opportunity to make something happen, we're going to really dig into the bag of tricks and not necessarily do something super creative, but something that maybe is a little bit more aggressive, a little ballsier. And I thought that was interesting. But, from a pass defense perspective, you look at the soft coverage that they ran, they really clearly prioritized not getting beat vertically. And that's something that I'm totally okay with after watching them for the last 2 years under Lincoln Riley just get burned consistently. on busted coverages in the deep back end of the secondary. And they clearly prioritized avoiding that. So, like you said, Garrett Nussmeier was getting the ball out very quickly because, I mean, at halftime, he was averaging 4.1 air yards per attempt. I mean, that's Oregon stuff, right? Like that's not really testing the secondary. That's almost an extension of the run game. I'm curious to see what that pass rush looks like when a team actually tries to push the ball down the field vertically, because it will happen at some point. You know, there will be an aggressive play caller that will think that they can isolate corners. But I thought what was really also interesting about the defensive coaching staff was I think they won the game of adjustments. And you look at what Kyron Lacey did in the first half, 7 catches,
Yeah.
94 yards, a touchdown, and was shut out in the second half. And it seemed pretty clear that Danton Lynn and Doug Belk, the secondary coach, made a choice that, okay, we're not going to let him beat us. You know, and Anderson had a great second half for LSU. So they did have players step up and contribute. It didn't, shut the offense down by any stretch. But I thought that was interesting because, frankly, we expected Alex Grinch to lose the adjustment battle every week for the last 2 years. And consistently, he proved us right in feeling that way. I'm curious, what was your perspective on kind of the halftime adjustments defensively? Because you hold a team to 10 points in the first half. You have to be pretty content with that. First quarter shutout in which the opposing offense had the ball for 12 to 15 minutes is a pretty significant accomplishment. But still, the defensive coaching staff made a series of adjustments that were impactful in that game.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to even just what you were talking about with, the approach to coverage and limiting a lot of those kind of explosive plays that doomed USC last year, because you saw LSU be very content at times with taking what they were given defensively in that first half. And Nussmeier, I thought, was doing a really solid job of that, even though he was, you know, throwing the ball 5 yards at a time. I thought, they were still moving the ball fairly well. USC was making plays on third down situations, but it looked like in the second half, they almost, it looked like offensively they tried to adjust to what, Danton Lynn was doing and USC's defense was doing in the first half, where they recognized that, they were, again, kind of taking what they were being given from a passing situation and made a very concerted effort to run the ball on first downs and try and establish the run game a little bit more, because that was getting swallowed up pretty good by USC in the first half. And so I think they ended up kind of playing right into USC's hands, from that perspective. And, call that an adjustment, what you will. They did a fantastic job of, like you said, taking away Kyron Lacey, who that penalty situation with Greedy Vance was interesting to say the least.
I think he should have
But
been kicked out of the game for that.
yeah, that
Personally,
was.
at the end of the day, I'm all about letting kids be kids, show their emotion. I think celebrating is a great thing. That was a wild one that I've never seen before,
I'm
and
not sure. I
not
don't
to
think
put the
you
kid on
can.
blast, but just
I
crazy.
I don't think you can fake point an air gun at. I don't. Yeah, I don't think you can fake shooting a kid, and then that felt. I understand, but that's yeah. I think that crosses a certain line.
I feel like that was legitimately unsportsmanlike conduct, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
there's celebrating too much and there's taunting and all those things are fun and well, and then there's whatever that was, and that was pretty outrageous. But
yeah,
neither here nor there. Glad they caught it when they caught it, and it was a chippy game to some extent, especially down this the stretch of the second half, and I thought that was all warranted and valid. But let's flip things over to the offensive side. I thought right away, first takeaway you have to have is that Miller Moss has some onions on him. I mean, that kid was as composed in both 2-minute offense situations as you could dream of. They didn't cash it in for points in the first half because Michael Lance missed a chip shot, but obviously the touchdown drive to win the game at the end. But it wasn't just those two situations in which he was so composed and impressive. I mean, I think there were a series of throws. You look at the cover two pop shot that he throws to Kyron Hudson for the one-handed catch and the targeting call. I mean, like that was a Caleb Williams esque throw in terms of the aggressive decision making, but also the trust in his arm to be able to get that there on time. Because that's an extremely high risk, high reward throw. And he also was getting pounded throughout much of the second half and continued to deliver on time, dropped a dime into Jacoby Lane on a seam route, got clocked in the process. I was so impressed with him. And it made me so happy to see him play the way he did, because I think, if anything, the way that that game went for him really was the perfect microcosm that's illustrative of who Miller Moss is and who we've been told he is, how he represents himself. That like he stuck through that game and made big plays when the opportunities presented themselves, just as he stuck through 4 years at USC and is trying to make the best of an opportunity now that he's given it. I'm curious your takeaways of Miller Moss. I mean, there's the obvious, there's the stats, there's the game-winning drive, but I was just so interested because you've seen him throughout all of fall camp, all of spring camp. To what extent was his performance on Sunday in line with what you'd seen? To what extent was it, a total revelation, if at all? I'm curious. Was there anything surprising about how Miller Moss played?
It was, I'd say, perfectly in line with everything that, how he has composed himself, presented himself, what his teammates have been saying about him. Not only, this fall and the spring, but just throwing it back to the last, 3 years about a guy waiting for his opportunity. And I think what stuck out most to me this game, and I thought you put it perfectly, of how just how he was able to stick through kind of the peaks and the valleys of this one offensively. In the Holiday Bowl, we saw him go out there and Lincoln Riley design a little bit more of a, I don't want to say simplistic offense, but just a little bit more predicated on let's just sling it. Let's just get the ball to our playmakers. Let's just design some vertical routes. And we saw Miller Moss really step into the limelight there and make some, you know, really aggressive and gutsy throws in that December, and him really step up there. And in this one, you saw a little bit more of, I think, the game management, the timing, playing within the system that just people point to as could still be a really strong strength for Lincoln Riley's offense when you look at ultimately, how the last couple of years with Caleb Williams have gone. I think Miller Moss was only pressured, I looked at it, he was only pressured on 15% of his dropbacks. It might have felt like more, but ultimately, however much you want to trust Pro Football Focus, but compared to Caleb Williams was pressured on 33% last year, and Miller Moss again just gets the ball out so much faster and on a consistent basis. And there's factors within that with him and Caleb, but I thought you saw a lot of that in the first half. Again, not playing really mistake free for the most part, making smart decisions, getting the ball out quick, eventually kind of finding a rhythm in that second quarter, and then like you said, in the fourth quarter, that's when we really kind of started to see. Lincoln Riley said this is a guy with a lot of alpha in him, and we saw a lot of that in that fourth quarter, and just the way he was able to kind of orchestrate those drives, especially after, and we can get to this, but a little bit of interesting play calling from Lincoln Riley's perspective, and clock management, especially towards the end of that first half. Thought the way that Miller Moss was able to keep his composure, and when you watch it back, yeah, that throw to Kyron Hudson, I think it was a 2nd and 15 or something with 18 seconds left, and to
Correct.
just
Yeah.
deliver that that's about, yeah, it takes about as much stones as you can get.
Yeah, I want to talk about the play calling. We can talk about game management and clock management. I think that's a problem that Lincoln
Mhm.
Riley has to work on. And actually, I think he's going to get better at that. I can explain why in just a minute. But the play calling was interesting because I didn't think it was bad necessarily. I think that Lincoln went into this game with priority number one in the first half being let's not make the critical error.
Yep.
Don't let this game turn into a 14-0 LSU and put us in a hole. Lincoln Riley likes to play from in front, likes to play with a lead. I thought that there were some creative aspects to it in the first half. I thought they utilized the tight end position really well. That was interesting.
Yep.
But I also felt like there was a little bit of deja vu in the running game. And
Yep.
it was interesting because I don't think it was a lack of commitment to the running game. They were fairly committed to it, but there was a lack of productivity. And to some extent, that's unsurprising, right? LSU had better players, I think, on the defensive line that USC has on the offensive line at this stage in their development. It's a pretty young offensive line. But it was concerning to see that pretty clearly this was not going to be a game where the Trojans would be able to run the ball with any consistency at all. I mean, ironically, of course, they win the game on a rushing touchdown, in the closing seconds. But to what extent do you walk out of this opening week win and say, hey, this is a glaring, alarm signal that we need to look at because you can't run the ball in the Big Ten. I mean, I think the Big Ten football thing is overplayed, and we've talked about that on the show before, but you've got to run the ball to win on the road in general, regardless of who you're playing. But Michigan in 3 weeks, you're going to need to run the ball some a little bit. So what do you make of this running situation? It's tough to really draw conclusions, but I do think that there's some red flags that have been raised.
Yeah, I'd fully agree. I think it's interesting because from a philosophical standpoint, you might think generally of Lincoln Riley as an air raid guy or whatever, but his most success that he's found offensively, back at Oklahoma and just throughout his career has been when he's been able to establish and utilize the run game at a really elite level. So it's certainly not a philosophical thing. I think just, in terms of um, the offensive line, I think Woody Marks played really, really gutsy in that game for the most part. But it looked at times like he and Miller were a little bit, I don't want to say out of sync, but just, they had a couple moments where, it seemed like either play action or handoffs or just plays didn't, end up, I don't know, developing quite as they were designed to. And I thought certainly you could have had the potential for a little more Quentin Joyner in this game, from a run game situation. I still think USC needs to kind of figure out what it has in its backs, and in this backfield. And again, there is a large emphasis on Woody Marks, the veteran, and he did really well in pass pro situations this game. So I understand the reliance on that, but um, I do think Lincoln Riley needs to do or place a little bit more of an emphasis on, you know, the creativity in the run game a little bit, how he's going to best utilize this backfield. That is kind of a key point. I mean, you saw just I can't remember what drive it was, but I think it was in the fourth quarter. They had, a 3rd and 6 situation and, call a timeout and then you run the ball with Woody Marks. It gets nowhere, 3-yard loss. Then you take another timeout and just, it was a situation that could have really hurt, USC's offense in the later stages of the game. So, um, going to be very important to establish the run a little bit more consistency as well to kind of open things up for Miller Moss and the wide receivers that they have. So yeah, definitely a point of emphasis in the coming weeks.
I think one thing we have to be conscientious of when talking about USC's run game, though, is I kind of think Lincoln's hands are tied just a little bit,
Yeah,
um, at least in the way that he traditionally wants to develop his running game, right? Like Lincoln Riley loves pulling his guards and his tight ends. And just to be perfectly honest about it, he does not have two particularly athletic guards in
yeah,
Alani Noah and Emmanuel Pregnon. They're big bodies, they're capable linemen, but having them move laterally as lead blockers is kind of a big ask for what they are, or at least where Noah is at in his development physically. That may be a different story next year, the year after, but I think that Lincoln Riley needs to revisit his running game and think about how he can kind of take a page out of Danton Lynn's book, right? And how do you put these guys in positions to make the best of who they are? And it's not going to be pulling Alani Noah, at least not every play. That's not something that he's just cut out for at this moment on that level. I mean, that's what Oklahoma did so well with Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine, and those guys have put up huge numbers. So I would be interested to see how this season develops in the run game and the way in which Lincoln adjusts his scheme to the personnel. I think it's a little concerning that he didn't really do that in game one. That's probably something that he could have known in the offseason, especially through fall camp. I mean, you can kind of get a read on what your personnel is capable of. And, so we'll see what happens with that. But, speaking of Lincoln and his game management, the two timeouts definitely, I think, were less than ideal. But Colin Cowherd made this point, and I tend to agree with it, that I'd rather be wasting timeouts than having my offense play in a hurried, disorganized, and confused way, turning the ball over.
yeah.
So if those are the trade-offs, and that's it's difficult to draw a true equivalency there because that's not what happened, right? We can't say they were going to turn the ball over. We can say that they're probably likelier to make a critical mistake if there's a lack of communication and confusion. But so I'm okay with him taking those timeouts. I think that there may be a little bit of feeling out going on as well on how to use the new communication system within the helmet, right? Like, to what extent do you use that? How well have they figured out their system? I think by week 3 or week 4, rather, when they go to the big house and play Michigan, they'll have had 2 games worth of data points to figure out, okay, this is the best way to use this. I think those communication issues will be remedied over time. But from a Lincoln Riley coaching standpoint, one thing that really jumped out to me, and did he handle the time management at the end of the first half? Well, absolutely not. It was a master class in wasting time. But what he did do throughout the game that I thought was really telling was the way that he actively sought the input of Matt Entz. And that was so telling to me because Matt Entz is the guy on staff with head coaching experience, right? So he's looking to him not as a linebackers coach, but as someone who has coached in big games, understands what it means to be a head coach, and was soliciting his opinion on things that didn't even necessarily involve the defense. I mean, he's looking to him in a game management context. How can I, use the full extent of my staff's experience and understanding to try and, win this game? So I'm curious. It was probably a little bit tougher to see that from your vantage point, being in the building, right? That's a little bit more visible on television, but that doesn't seem like something that I think we would have said a year ago or 2 years ago. That Lincoln Riley is looking to one of his kind of lower level assistants. I mean, it's a little bit of like an ensemble cast at USC, right? Because they have a lot of these highly paid assistants in position coach roles, but at the end of the day, Matt Entz is a linebackers coach, and to recruit his opinion on big picture things, I think it should be a very encouraging sign for USC that the issues that we've highlighted on both sides of the ball very well may be remedied because of a collaborative approach that I'm not sure Lincoln Riley would have taken a year or two ago simply out of stubbornness.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because we weren't able to see too much of that, from up in the press box. And I think if he was consulting, with Matt, I think that just speaks a lot to the trust that he has in this new staff. I mean, I think every single one of them had their roles to play and executed them really strongly on Sunday. And Lincoln has spoken of Matt Entz as just, a guy with this incredible amount of experience and knowledge and wisdom, and it would make sense that he's, looking to him for more than just, you know, where to position Eric Gentry and Mason Cobb and that sort of thing. And so um, I do think that's a really, kind of interesting aspect that probably shows. I mean, the one thing that, if you talk to coaches in Lincoln Riley's past, there might be a picture of him from kind of an external, bird's eye view standpoint of, a pretty stubborn guy who's not, gonna kind of change his ways for a lot of respects, and he's honestly presented himself as such to, media at times and just publicly. But, behind the scenes, I think coaches throughout kind of his developmental process will say that, there's not a lot of ego to him from a coaching perspective, and he is very, receptive to change and to, working with staff. He did a lot of it, when he was coming up at East Carolina. And I think it's interesting that maybe you'll see a little bit more of that as well with the staff that USC has put together this season. And I think Lincoln would probably say that, he has the staff, and it would be crazy not to utilize that at times for, more than their titles on paper, I suppose. So yeah, definitely kind of an interesting thing to watch for the rest of the year. And I just want to return really quickly to um, what we were just previously talking about with the run game a little bit, because it occurs to me that, your point about maybe not having the most agile offensive linemen or guards and what have you, and Lincoln Riley kind of having to potentially adapt there. I don't know how much of kind of a bell cow, power guy Woody Marks is going to be in terms of his ability to consistently kind of, run between the tackles and push behind those guards and that sort of thing. And I think that's where maybe we might more consistently see a little bit of Quentin Joyner, maybe a little bit of freshman Brian Jackson at times, just in terms of kind of that power back utilization if USC kind of has to utilize the inside run game a little bit more instead of those counters. You saw a little bit of that from Woody Marks, but interesting points all around from what's going to be next for Lincoln Riley this year.
Yeah, and to finish the thought on the run game, right? It makes some sense to use the older guy in a game like that where that pass protection is going to
Yeah,
be so important, right?
exactly.
Typically, young running backs struggle in pass protection. Joyner's a redshirt freshman, Jackson's a true freshman. It's a big ask of those guys to be the last line of defense. But I think you're spot on that we'll see a little bit more running back by committee probably, because Woody Marks is like a 15 touches a game kind of running back. He's not a
Yeah,
25 a game guy. And that's one thing this team is missing from a personnel standpoint. I mean, Travis Dye, right? How great of a fit would he be on this team? But 2 years too late. It brings me to a bigger picture thing. Like, I think it's really easy to overreact to this game because
yeah,
you beat an SEC opponent. It was a game where pretty consistently across the board, national analysts picked against USC. But I mean, my takeaway watching this game was pretty simple, and my predictions for this team don't change. I still think 9-3 is the likeliest. The route to 10-2 got a lot easier by beating LSU. 8-4 is definitely possible, but I think less likely than 9-3. I think they're going to be a fringe playoff team that needs some things to break the right way and needs to win a couple of big games. But my big takeaway was there are a couple things we can count on with this team, I think, every week. They're going to show up with the effort that at times has been questionable in the last decade at USC. I think we're going to get an A-plus level effort from this team consistently. And I think we're going to get great coaching and scheme. The one thing that I do think is a problem is personnel. This is not a championship level roster. I think LSU was better at most positions from a talent perspective. I'd give USC the wide receivers Probably a push at the quarterback position and maybe a slight edge in the defensive backs. But everywhere else, it felt like LSU had better players and just simply got beat by a better team and better coaches. I'm curious what your, where you fall on kind of that question of, this still isn't a USC team that we should be expecting to win a national championship. It's probably not a USC team that we could. I think the ceiling would be like winning a playoff game in the first round, but there's no pathway to the Final Four. They just don't have the horses. There will be some games this year, and probably against Michigan, where the coaching will be there, the effort will be there, and they just don't have the horses for 60 minutes. And that's just how it's going to be.
Yeah, I think that's very, very probable. Ultimately, I think USC's season and a lot of this, a lot of what was emphasized with them bringing in the defensive staff they did, not even talking about the offense for a second, but was the developmental perspective, and that piece was really highly emphasized, and you see that being really important and necessary now with the personnel that they have because from a talent standpoint, there's a lot of depth, but there aren't those consistent, proven high level guys up and down the roster. And this year is going to count on Eric Gentry playing at that level for 12 games, for Mason Cobb, playing at his absolute peak, for guys like Jameel Muhammad and Braylon Shelby to take a leap, and Bear Alexander and Gavin Meyer, and you know so many of these guys to play as the best version of themselves. And USC is really kind of betting on and banking on that, and betting on their coaches that they can get that out of them. And at a certain point, again, as you mentioned, against a team like Michigan, that just might not be enough. And kind of, gut might not be enough. And I think, there wasn't a lot of national championship talk from within USC's own walls for a reason, or at least publicly to media, and a little bit of expectation management for a reason. And I do think that they are capable, and certainly so far, of far exceeding the expectations that were in place for them this year. But you know, I think this year, in maybe the ideal, big picture standpoint for USC, or from Lincoln Riley's viewpoint, or however you want to look at it, is to be able to look back at it and say, we built a roster and a culture that is clearly capable of rising to that national championship level, with the development, with the coaching staff that we have. Again, you talked about the recruiting piece at the beginning, but, showcasing that this is a program that guys should want to feel a part of and comfortable in, and develop within. Kind of a large contrast to what was present last year. And so I think that is kind of the way forward. Obviously, winning is going to be a part of that. I do think this team, as constructed, can absolutely make a college football playoff. How far they get, like you said, debatable. But I think from a big picture standpoint, this year is going to be more about, providing that really strong, almost foundation for the future in the Big Ten, and reestablishing USC as kind of, this is a place that you want to be, essentially.
I thought week one was really interesting because it's only 1 week, so it's a single data point. We really have to be careful to not overreact in any way for any team. But just kind of watching Oregon on Saturday and USC on Sunday, it felt like two programs that have trajectories that are very, very different. And Oregon is going to consistently win and be a national contender because they will always have an excellent roster. But at the same time, it felt like okay, this is a team that does not have that cultural foundation. They've assembled a group of, highly recruited mercenaries to some extent, and they struggled mightily against Idaho, who, albeit is a good FCS team, but was also breaking in a new quarterback. Otts Stadium's always a tough place to play, So I don't want to make too much of a big deal out of struggling as much as they did with Idaho. But with USC, you see the counterpoint where it's like we see something that is beginning to build. You can see what they're trying to accomplish in building this foundation. Whereas a program like Oregon, you don't really see what they're doing. It almost seems like they've skipped that step and gone to like a prefab house and just had it delivered by Home Depot, which will get you wins. Probably not going to get you the big win, but it's really interesting. I think your point is spot on that like the big goal for this year isn't really to win anything of substance, to be perfectly honest. I don't think that's ever been the goal. The goal has been to show really valid, visible progress towards a greater goal. And progress does not necessarily come in the form of win-loss record, right? Progress comes in the form of tangible things that you can see, like effort, right? Like this game was absolutely massive from the standpoint that it did demonstrate an entirely different mentality within the walls at USC than we've seen since 2008. I think that's the last time USC had a team that legitimately played hard for 4 quarters and didn't coast on talent for any part of it. I thought that was a hallmark of the Lane Kiffin and Clay Helton eras, coasting on talent and, winning games you're supposed to win and losing games you're supposed to win. I don't worry about that as much with this team. One group of individuals, though, who is highly liable to overreact to things are young high school age recruits. And I'm interested what your take is on like the recruiting impact of this win, right? Because no one's gonna just commit to USC because they beat LSU. Like whoever's pipe dream is that Jakeem Stewart watched USC beat LSU and that made his decision for him. Like that's not how it works. It's not how it's gonna happen. But like to some extent, there is truth to the if you win, they will come, which seems to be what Lincoln Riley has pushed his chips in on. That if we win, they're going to want to be here. They're going to come. We're going to keep doing what what we're doing. You know, this is a step, I think, in the direction of that larger goal of winning enough to convince these players that it's going to happen here. But what's your takeaway on like the recruiting impact, not of this game specifically, but of a game like this, of a win like this for a program that didn't previously have a signature win under its head coach?
I think the larger scale impact is that it shows that this talk of still the rebuild that Lincoln Riley has preached entering year 3, and this the shift in philosophy, the changes that they've made, everything from the progress on getting stronger, on building the staff that he's so heavily praised. It shows that all of it is leading in the right direction, and there is truth to the words. There's truth to you know that kind of buzz manufactured within the walls of USC that's spreading elsewhere. And I think that is kind of the important facet of it, and it establishes that there it's a long season ahead, but recruits can look at this game and say like that's a program, that is a culture, that's a place that you would want to be a part of, and obviously we don't know certainly what's going on behind the scenes or this and that, but from a bird's eye view, you have a guy like Miller Moss at the helm who's commanded the respect of his teammates and is clearly a huge part of that culture shift. You have these clearly this kind of uh elation in the locker room post game, and a lot of guys who sacrificed and bought into more limited roles in some facet. Even you look at a guy like Bear Alexander, who kind of did that on Sunday. And if that continues and just kind of stacks up through the rest of the season, like you've built yourself a program that's very, very, you know, kind of attractive in a little bit of the old school sense to recruits. And you pair that with assuming there's, still being progress made on the NIL front, assuming that USC is prepared for revenue share, you've suddenly built yourself a program. They keep harping on the facilities, the new practice facility, whatever, that is very, that checks a ton of boxes for recruits no matter where they're coming from across the nation. And I think that is probably where their hat is being hung on in terms of the impact of this game. Is it's a really strong building block for that kind of foundation in their, you know, recruiting and their developmental future. So I would say that's, there were the entire, you know, college football nation was watching that game. There's no way to avoid the outcome, what have you. And I think that as well, to do that on a prime time stage in Vegas, in front of that crowd. DirecTV was having its problems, but regardless, really important from a national buzz standpoint.
Well, good news is if you're a DirecTV subscriber, this week's game is on the Big Ten Network, so you shouldn't have any trouble finding that one. USC beats LSU 27-20. This week they're back at it on Saturday night, 8 o'clock kickoff at home against Utah State. Luca, anything to plug you got coming out this week?
I think just, coverage should have a pretty interesting feature. I'm thinking of, well, I won't, get too deep into it, but it should be an interesting feature coming on Thursday. And so just keep an eye out and subscribe to Orange County Register.
Always love to read your work. It's such a fun thing for me, especially knowing that we get to talk, hopefully now on a weekly basis. We're working on making that happen. A shameless plug on my end. If you're a fan of high school football or like to dream about high school players at your college, big game on the Bally Sports family of networks, be syndicated nationally as Bishop Gorman comes to play Mater Dei on Friday night in a battle of two quasi college programs. I mean, in many ways, it's the battle of everything that's wrong with high school football, but that's neither here nor there. It should be a high level game, a lot of fun if you like football. And it's a good segue into Saturday as the Trojans get back to work against Utah State. Luca, as always, I appreciate your time. It's great to hear your perspective, and I'm glad you had a blast of a time in Las Vegas covering the Trojans.
Thanks again for the time, Cooper. Always love chatting with you.
Until next time, you've been listening to the Believe in USC podcast.